Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the No Apologies Stand 2020 online conference that continues, though the world is going through some COVID crisis madness. We are absolutely delighted to be bringing today to our listening and viewing audience Professor Daniel Reynaud, and our topic, we've loosely called it the Anzacs and God, or God in Wartime. For those who are not from Australia and New Zealand, which is most of the world, ANZAC stands for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Very much a signature part of the Australian and New Zealand psyche. To welcome you today, Daniel, thanks again very much for your time. We had a lovely chat in the I call it the green room, I guess, the waiting room off there. Lovely to get to know that we're not going to be spending too much money on hot coffee or hot tea when you come and visit, but something, maybe a frozen banana drink, Harvey, would be more in order, considering it's Coffs Harbour here. We'll work something that suits you. Daniel, how are you today? Tell us where you are and how your week has been. Let's just make an informal start.
Right. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here. I'm in Cooranbong, New South Wales. That's on the southern edge of Lake Macquarie. It's where I work. I work at Avondale University College, and the week has been finalising the semester for students. So we're bringing to an end a very different semester where after week 3 we had to teach entirely online.
And what degrees, what awards are you coordinating or lecturing on at the moment?
So I supervise several PhD students, and I lecture in modern history and a little bit of literature. I teach Bible as literature in various bachelor degrees.
Fantastic. Well, so folks, today's topic is one that's very close to the surface. We've been trying to coordinate a time and a date with Professor Reynaud for a number of months now, and it just seemed like the coordination gremlins were against us. However, as you'll see as we go through the session today, that it's even more pertinent now than possibly this topic is more pertinent now than it perhaps was 2, 3 or 4 months ago. Steve, I'm wondering if you could please just swap to the first slide, and I'll bring that up to get our questions going. And for the want of getting started and introducing you to our viewing and listening audience, how did you get started? What piqued your interest in your focus area? And by that, please generally introduce us to your work.
Okay, so I was looking for a research topic when I was starting my doctorate, and at the time I was lecturing in media and English, so I needed a media topic. But being a historian by nature, I looked for something interdisciplinary, and I decided to look at the idea of Anzac cinema. So my doctorate is actually a study of Anzac movies and television programs from 1914 through to the present. And obviously there was a point where I was going to run out of films because they're not making them at the rate that I'm studying them. So I began looking around for what else could I do, and I've always had an interest in war and warfare, the history of war, Anzac history, World War I and II. And I'm also passionate about faith and God. And so I thought, why not look at the intersection of those two things? And it's an area that has received almost no attention at all. There are a few historians who've delved into it, but it's certainly not an issue that Australian historians in general, nor the Australian public are terribly interested in. But I found it fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. I've produced four books, I think, and some documentaries.
Fantastic. Wow. What other interest have you found around the world? If there's not much happening in the research topic in Australia and New Zealand, and you're sort of in your green field, what do you see internationally in this area?
Interestingly enough, it's kind of similar. It's actually a growth area in research, but all of us are battling received opinion, even amongst professional historians, that there is something worthwhile to say in this area. I've communicated with historians in Britain, for example, who say, why does everybody say that the war turned people off religion, that religion and God got a bad serve out of the Great War? In fact, there are many, many interesting things to say, and there are researchers in Canada, America, in France, and Turkey, Russia, who are focusing their attention on this interaction between the Great War and religious belief. And there's some work being done on World War II as well.
Fantastic. I do notice there's maybe a little bit out of left field, but maybe related in some way. Last year, I think it was last year, there was the Mel Gibson film. I can't remember the exact title of it. Hacksaw Ridge. I knew it had a ridge and an H, and I knew it wasn't hamburger. So, what are your thoughts on that? As is Mel playing in your field a little bit?
Yeah, well, that was interesting because the producers actually rang me while they were making it because they wanted some advice. I lecture at a Seventh-day Adventist institution. The story's about a Seventh-day Adventist. So they actually asked me some questions about dress standards, how a church of that era might have been decorated. I noticed they took some of my advice and not other bits. Look, I mean, this is the intersection of all my research, war, religion, and cinema.
Fascinating. Did you get a free ticket?
Yeah, movies tell a certain kind of truth about war. If you're looking for facts, they're a terrible place to go. If you're looking for emotions, they're a much better representation. I mean, that film skipped over so many things that were motivators in the life of its hero, primarily faith being a motivator, and instead deflected it to an abusive father. Which but movies have got no compulsion, no brief to be historically accurate. They have to be emotionally accurate. They have to persuade their audience. And
so Ben-Hur, you're not sure where to go?
Look, are you asking me as a historian or as a cinema goer?
You could take one side each. Give yourself a cinema goer to start with and then a historian after that.
Look, having watched an awful lot of war movies, there are very few that I can watch comfortably.
Sure.
People ask me about, what's the recent English film out last year? 1917, indeed, and they asked me about that, and I'm sorry, I have to say that there is not one moment where the film persuaded me to suspend disbelief.
Sure.
And if it can't do that, then it can't do anything else. Look, it's an impressive film. Technically, it's amazing. I like the way he stitched all those shots together to hide the edits. It has many wonderful qualities. But for someone like me who knows so much, the opening premise was false and never got better.
What do they say about a movie? Never let the truth get in the way
of a good story.
And that's the function of fiction. Fiction can tell a certain kind of truth that history can't, and that's why we need literature and film. As a historian, yes, I am restricted to speaking about what I have evidence to support, and quite often I do not have the interior life. Right? It's not documented. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. That doesn't mean it isn't real. That doesn't mean that there is no truth there to be said. It is a truth, but I can't speak about it as a historian. I need filmmakers and novelists to speak of that truth.
Great. Well, bouncing off from that, Steve, would you mind moving us to the next slide, please? And I'll bring that up and let's delve into this. And this is one of one of those things you're talking about, not being able to delve too much into the inner truth that was there. But from your research, what can you say about this question? Were Anzacs into God? How do you know? What are the research examples, and what can we learn from this? I mean, it's a bit of a very broad brush. I'll leave that up there for a little bit just to help you orient your way around that. But how do you respond to that?
Well, I'm not sure that "into God" is a very helpful phrase for us, but it's a great place to start. For a start, we have to recognise that the culture in 1914-18, the Australian culture, was vastly different from what it is today. That is to say, virtually everybody in Australia in 1914 would have called themselves Christian. They'd have been offended if you didn't, if you said they weren't. Christian wasn't necessarily a set of beliefs. It was a kind of a cultural practice, a package of values and attitudes. And so while we often look back and call the Anzacs secular men, and they were to a large degree, it doesn't mean the same as secular today means. It's vastly different. These are men who were secular but believed in God. These are men who are secular but believe the Bible history is fundamentally true. So let me give you some examples.
Yes,
I started from the premise of Bill Gamage's book, The Broken Years. In the introduction, he says there are 3 silences in soldier diaries. He read the diaries of 1,000 men. I've read the diaries of 1,000 men when I wrote my second book on the topic. I've now read about 1,200. And he said 3 silences: sex, politics, and religion. And of the 3, he found religion the most surprising. And yet his book is studded with religious quotes, with quotes about faith, belief, morality, highlighting the fact that Australian historians are extremely uncomfortable with the notion of spirituality and religion, if not absolutely blind to the evidence under their nose, because they have a preconception that we are a secular society. So I thought, look, at least 10% of them must have been religious, because that's roughly the percentage of people who went to church. I read 1,000 diaries, taking notes from diaries that talked about religion or faith or spirituality or morality. And I found well over a third talked about those topics.
That's a huge percentage.
That's a huge percentage when you say there's no evidence. It's still a long way from a majority, right?
Well, that's true.
I've come across... I've come across 1 or 2 Christian writers who want to make all the Anzacs, God's warriors, spiritual men, and that is unsupportable. What we can say, and by the way, the third who write about religion aren't always religious, but I would estimate that 20 to 25% of the Anzacs took faith seriously to some degree or other. So about a quarter to a fifth. And that, by the way, is the same percentage of Anzacs who were born in the UK. That, by the way, is about the same percentage of Anzacs who came from the bush.
Sure.
4 out of 5 Anzacs were city men. So the interesting thing is that the Anzac legend has developed into a narrative about Australian bushmen who make up 1 in 5, but has entirely edited out of the narrative the fact that the same percentage are born in the UK, the same percentage are actively religious.
I think that's fascinating. And the editing out, we do have a question on that sense of editing. So I won't follow down that rabbit hole just yet, because I know that's coming up. But I'm just wondering, Harvey, if you've got any thoughts or questions. I know you're happily sitting there on mute at the moment. What's churning through your brain?
Yeah, I was fascinated by the stats you brought up, Daniel. Quite clearly, you'll get an idea from the writings of the soldiers' diaries and so on, the degree of personal involvement and dialogue with God or questions that may come up with, as if they were communicating in writing to a God with whom they had had some interaction, or it was an oblique reference to God as a good luck charm in case trouble came their way, and they would be wanting to invoke God or God in their explanation of the times, rather than reflecting some personal interaction and indicating that there was more of a relationship as opposed to a knowledge about, which would reflect them as either Christians who've got an active faith or Christians who are immersed in a Christian culture and are just borrowing icons from it.
Well, I think you have the full spectrum. You have to recognise that 2/3 of the diaries and letters that I read did not refer to God or religion or faith at all. As a historian, it's difficult to argue from silence, but it does mean something, but not necessarily as much as we might think. For example, I read the diary of a soldier who never mentioned anything about religion or faith or God, like complete utter silence. Now, it just so happens that his letters home have also been preserved, and they are full of conversations about God and faith and his spiritual connection with God in and out of battle. So if I only read the diary, I would have the impression of a secular man. But when I read the letters, I go, no, this man is highly connected. And look, they run the full spectrum. There are some diaries that faithfully record every Sunday being at church. Now, you say big deal, they were compulsory. Well, yes, they were, except on Gallipoli, where it was difficult to make it compulsory. He makes no other comment. He makes no faith statement, no reference at all. Every Sunday, there it is, church, such and such, whatever the time was, occasionally who the preacher was. And I go to myself, what is it that makes a man go out of his way to go to church services when they're not compulsory? I have no other statement than the mere commitment that man made every Sunday. And I have to go, well, I don't know what he believed, but I certainly know that he felt that church was important enough to go to when most of his mates aren't going. So sometimes I'm deducting from that level of evidence.
Yeah, I wonder on that as well. And Steve, just let me know if you've got other thoughts or comments to chip in as well. Maybe wink or do something like that, or put your finger up so I can see. But I'm wondering, Daniel, you're looking, prima facie at these diaries, these letters. Other research that you do that helps you set the context of the time and the culture of the time. How do you go about, and how have you gone about the setting for your focus work in the broader context?
Right. Well, I rely a lot on the scholarship of other historians, and there is material out there about the religious history and the degree to which people were church oriented, or the degree to which religion formed a fundamental mindset, a basis from which everyone operated. And look, there is consensus there. Historians don't fight over the fact that in 1914, Australia, like Britain, like America, Canada, New Zealand, were fundamentally Christian in their worldview, in their values, but that people weren't necessarily Christian in their beliefs, their specific beliefs. That is to say, they didn't go to church, or if they did go to church, it was something that they did. Most people could not give you any theological explanation for anything. They knew the Bible from Sunday school. They were familiar with its general contents, but by and large, they were relatively religiously ignorant, but still believed. I mean, I've got, in my last book, I've got the story of a guy who who says outright several times, "I'm not religious." The very next word is always "but." And
Interesting.
then, you know, he visits Bethlehem. He's an officer in the Light Horse in Palestine. And he speaks about the wonder of seeing the birthplace of our Saviour. You know, and this is from a self-proclaimed not religious man.
Interesting as to what it might mean for him. So, Steve, I did notice Harvey had a finger up first. I might just throw, and then come back to you. Is that all right?
Yes,
Harvey, you do have to go off. There we go.
Yeah, I was going to ask you exactly what you've just touched on. Oblique mentions, of course, of God, whoever you may conceive him to be, or the understanding of the soldier per se. It doesn't, of course, indicate that the reference to God is of Christian God or of a biblical God. I would be interested to know whether or not there had been mentions made of Jesus, who is, of course, central to the Christian faith. God, who's somewhat nebulous and vague, may be often referenced, but Jesus in particular, what sort of percentage of times did he come up in those who invoked a religious basis for their commentary?
Right. Reasonably often, but the other thing I would note is that their concept of God during the First World War was a fundamentally Christian one. They believed in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, even if they didn't think of themselves as religious. There was basically no alternative worldview. I've even stumbled across diaries of men who've toyed with atheism, and their atheism is an incredibly Christian one. I've come across diaries of men who are aggressively anti-religious, but their anti-religion is extremely religious. That is, their opposition to Christianity isn't because Christianity is wrong. It is because the things that they once believed seem to have been betrayed by what's happened in the war and the way people are behaving. So they've lost faith in Christianity, not because the doctrines are wrong, but because Christianity isn't living up to what it ought to be. You have this tremendous sense of loss and regret in their attacks on Christianity. Not so much attacks on God and Jesus, although some do. I mean, one man with a brilliant story very aggressively says, you know, what sort of God would permit this kind of thing? And you feel the despair in his voice, the sense of loss that he has, that you know, everything he believed in has let him down. And he saw it.
Sorry, Daniel, I think I just dropped in over there with a bit of echo. Steve, your question.
Yeah, I guess, you know, probably first up a comment, I guess, and then probably a question from that comment. Is it true to say, particularly from your historical perception, that definitions of words really matter? In other words, what we today think of somebody as religious is quite different to what somebody would have thought, let's say, during the First World era. And I'm now thinking particularly of this sort of staunch British stoic kind of mentality of people who were deeply Christian wouldn't have liked to have been called religious, because that there's a certain emotional attachment in those days to the word religion that doesn't seem to be attached in the same way today, and people look at it differently, and that therefore many people who were actually very well Christian didn't like the idea of being called religious because of the connotations that are attached to the word. That's sort of certainly what I picked up from my reading in terms of Churchill, and I think that's sort of the idea that I get from him, that he was very similarly deeply convicted about God and the Christian worldview, but he would never have liked somebody saying he's a religious man, because that would have interfered with his deeply sort of stoic British stiff upper lip mentality of no, I'm that, because that would be the quintessential statement of saying I'm weak. I need religion to uphold me, which I think that sort of is that what you're saying, or is that something that you would agree with?
I'll go along with about half of it. There is no doubt that multiple times I've come across statements where people go, you know, we're British. Even Australians thought of themselves as British at the time. We're British. We don't show emotion. And you know, I've got appeals to a legendary chaplain, William Mackenzie, the famous Salvation chaplain, saying, "Please put your Scottish reserve aside and allow us to praise you." And others actually make that statement in the context of, you know, it's not befitting a true British person to exhibit religious enthusiasm. In fact, one of the insults put to new religions from mainstream British religions was enthusiasm. They, you know, demonstrating enthusiasm was how could you do such a thing? So yes, there is that sense of reserve, and I've actually got a number of quotes in my book on Anzac spirituality where perceptive men say it's easy to think that the Anzacs are not religious, but don't be taken in by their superficial appearance, because fundamentally, when you get down to it, when you break behind this facade of, you know, reserve, these men are fundamentally spiritual men.
It's an interesting observation about the culture at the time, and maybe just a little anecdote while Steve gets the next slide ready and we move on to the next question. But as a kid growing up in the 70s in Australia, I was subjected to watching the Sullivans on almost felt like an hourly basis, but it was a nightly basis. But that was, you know, the quintessential story, World War II, the Australian family and all the boys at war. And there, it was a World War II story, but the idea of God being around them and people living appropriately, or even talk about living in sin at that stage, even represented in the 1970s, you know, going back onto the 1940s, that concept was still strong. So it's an interesting, I guess, cultural anecdote.
Let me follow up quickly before Steve flicks the slide. The second part was where I disagreed with you, Steve, and that is to say, I don't think religion was a dirty word yet.
Okay, that's good.
In 1914-18. I think that is a post-World War I development.
Very good.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's interesting, because, you know, like that, it's important to hear that from your perspective, being
Dan, can I have a very quick question to sneak in there?
Go ahead, Harvey.
From your reading of the diaries, did you notice in the diaries of the soldiers you read, there was a prominence of any other kind of worldview, source of morality? For example, Eastern philosophies like reincarnation, or naturalistic, fatalistic Darwinism, underscoring their records. Did you come across that in any great degree? I think it would be more prominent now, but then, did you have any?
Look, I have examples, but they're notable for their exceptionalism.
Okay.
It was, you've got to remember how monocultural Australia was in 1914. It was overwhelmingly British. And for instance, I've actually enumerated in Anzac spirituality the number of men who listed themselves as being Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim. The biggest non-Christian religion in the Anzacs was Judaism, and they numbered just over 1,000, right? You're talking about 330,000 men who enlisted, and 1,000 are Jews. In fact, the top four denominations, so Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, account for, you know, 90% of all the Anzacs, and then you throw in the other small ones like the Baptist, Salvation Army, Congregationalists. less than 0.1% of the Anzacs don't belong to 8 or 10 major denominations. So their worldview is overwhelmingly Christian. And some, for example, claim atheism, but I've got a chaplain who writes and goes, this fella claims he's an atheist. He doesn't even know what an atheist is, you know. When I talk to him, I can see he's not an atheist. Their atheism has a Christian worldview. One guy talks about evolution. He's a university graduate. And it's clear that Darwinism has raised significant questions in his mind about Christianity. But it's also clear that he believes the tenets of Christianity, including a literal creation and the flood, you know, things like this. So in other words, even the best educated hadn't fully resolved the apparent tensions between Christianity and other worldviews that they were shifting towards. They actually held them simultaneously, and I find that fascinating.
And just as another slice within, since we're talking about sort of passing the data of the, you know, the church demographics, so to speak, Harvey's popped in the chat pod there, and I might as well say it while I've got the mic now. Did this include, say, the Aboriginals and the Maoris who were a part of the forces?
Right. I can't speak with any expertise on Maori forces in the New Zealand division. They were present. Probably most of them were Christianised to some degree. Aboriginals in the Australian forces were only admitted if they were considered predominantly white. And of course, that definition varied according to, first of all, who the recruiting officer was, and secondly, how desperate the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, was for new recruits. So it's a flexible bar, but it was a barrier. So it does mean that most Aboriginal members of the AIF had, to some degree, a European influence as well.
Right.
I have not come across the beliefs of any Aboriginal member of the AIF, so I can't comment in depth.
Okay. No, great. No, thanks. Well, we'll move on to our next question. And why do you feel like, why is the relationship between Anzacs and God so important to Australians and Kiwis, talking about contemporary Australians and Kiwis now, and the rest of the world?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because increasingly secular commentators are labelling the Anzac legend as Australia's national secular faith. Right? And that's a really interesting phrase. And it's not coming from Christians, it's coming from secular scholars who observe that the narrative of Anzac, which is probably the only unifying national narrative we have anymore, you know, Cook's a bit on the nose, the First Fleet's a bit on the nose, all other things are not terribly acceptable. Australia Day is certainly contentious, but somehow or other, Anzac Day has survived as the point where we all come together. Christmas and Easter, we're trying to de-Christianise them so we don't offend anybody. But Anzac survives, and it's got all the hallmarks of a religion. It's got a national cathedral. The War Memorial is actually built like a cathedral. It's in the shape of one. Its exhibits are dimly lit so that they're there to be revered, not seen sharply. You know, there are temples in every little town and hamlet, RSL clubs and monuments and halls dedicated to Anzac. It has pilgrimages. You can go to the War Memorial, you can go to Gallipoli or Villas Bretonnier or do the Kokoda Trail. It's got doctrine. As an Anzac scholar, one thing that struck me is how many people get hostile towards me if I question any element of the Anzac legend. And there are many dimensions of the Anzac legend that ought to be questioned. They are, like all myths, they take truth and edit it in order to make a point. And I've got no problem with stuff being edited to make a point. My point is, let's not confuse that with what actually happened. Now, one of the ways in which the Anzac legend has been edited is to remove all references to religion. And there are historical reasons for that. Australia has long had a discomfort with putting religion up front. And I think some of the reasons behind this are good. In a sparsely populated country, when you've come from a legacy of religious intolerance and religious bigotry and religious war, when people settled Australia, they came with a conscious desire to leave behind the worst features of Europe and try and build something new. And one of the things they wanted to lose was that religious intolerance. It didn't mean they wanted to lose religion, but in order to remove it as an irritant, they took it out of the public conversation. That's a great difference, say, between Australia and America. Studies have shown that Australians on average are about as religious as Americans, but you'd never know it by visiting both societies. So, you know, if your closest neighbour is 20 kilometres away and he's Catholic and I'm Anglican, and I need his help or he needs my help, we don't want to have a legacy of punch-ups over religion getting in the road. Yeah. So we've retired religion from the public conversation. And when it came to creating Anzac Day, and there are some really great histories of the origins and development of Anzac Day, one of the key propagators was an Anglican clergyman, you know, David Garland, and many of the features he introduced to Anzac Day remain. But this is an era where Catholics were banned from attending services run by any other denomination. How do you have a religious service on an Anzac Day? You would immediately divide your audience. And so what they did was, let's keep the trappings of religion, but dispose of anything that is specifically religious. And that way, everybody could meet together, everybody could get on, celebrate Anzac Day. So we've developed this secular narrative about Anzac, which reflects a national conversation, a national image that Australia is secular. No, we're not secular. We just don't put religion up front. And so I think what's missing, or one of the elements missing from the Anzac narrative, is their relationship to faith. And I find it ironic that Australia has made Anzac their national religion.
It does feel like that.
And yet, we're not the slightest bit curious about the religion of the actual Anzacs.
Mm. Now, I had a couple of questions come in from Harvey in the chat pod. So, Harvey, if you'd just like to unmute and just chat to those for a moment.
I think I'll ask my second question first, Daniel, if you've got an opinion on it. As a historian, you will have looked, of course, at the Anzacs adversaries, the Turks, and how does their history then and their history now view the Anzac spirit and the Anzac legends?
We flatter ourselves that the Turks are actually interested in us. They're not, by and large. I've been to Gallipoli multiple times, filming documentaries, taking tour groups, whatever. There's actually a monument there where Kemal Ataturk is supposed to have said, you know, you women can rest easy because your sons are our sons now. Well, for a start, he never said that. And secondly, the Turks are not terribly interested. When we were filming there one day, we were talking about Chunuk Bair and the Kiwis having captured that, and then waves and waves of Turkish soldiers running over the top of the hill and pushing them off. And just as we were saying that, waves of modern Turkish soldiers came over the crest into the trenches where we were, because this is where the Turkish army takes its recruits to take their oath of allegiance. They take them to Gallipoli. So Gallipoli is central to the Turkish national narrative as well. But in a very nationalistic manner. In fact, the new president, very much anti-Kemal Ataturk, is trying to erase Ataturk from that narrative and turn it into a triumph of Muslim Turkey against the Christianized West. We think, you know, that we're now brothers with the Turks. we've inflated our own importance. By and large, the Turks are fairly ignorant, or well, not ignorant, but they're just not interested. It's not their story. Their story is the West tried to invade us and we beat them.
Yeah, it's very unusual for Australians to inflate their international reputation. Why would we? No, kidding. We're very good at doing that. Steve, I see you have the next question set up, so I'll move to that one now. Almost set up. There we go. So, Daniel, what did the Anzacs believe they were doing? What do you think they thought they were trying to achieve?
Okay. This is an era where God, King, and Empire are seen as a holy trinity. Okay? It never occurred to most people that there was any gap between God and the British Empire. They assume the righteousness of the war. They don't query it in any way. Read the diaries of chaplains, and this is also a period of intense racial prejudice. Australia is openly and aggressively white Australia, and there's hardly any dissent in that way at all. And the diaries of soldiers, the diaries of chaplains repeatedly make this point of white Australia and white men beating other people. The Anzacs fought to keep Australia white and British, and that's something that we forget. This is a bit that we edit out. Australia was deeply racist at the time. I mean, my heritage is French. I was barely born in Australia. My parents and my older siblings are all French. The Anzacs actually fought to keep me out. I laugh every year watching the Anzac Day parades on television, because you watch the bands from the schools of Western Sydney marching down the street, and excuse the language, but it's Spot the White Kid. It is the ethnicities of the world who are playing in honour of the men who fought and died for our freedom. Yes, they did, but they fought and died for the freedom to make sure that those kids never got into Australia. Now, that's a historical reality. We edit it out.
It's not a popular message, is it?
No, we've got to accept the fact that values change over time. And look, this is one value that I'm really happy we've changed. A recognition that we're all God's children, not just white people. But wouldn't it be healthy of us to recognise that the origins of the Anzac legend are deeply rooted in a racism that we now reject? There's an honesty, there's a recognition, there's a capacity to think beyond a Pavlovian myth that goes, oh, we wonderful Aussies, standing up for our freedom, and recognise that freedom gets defined different ways in different cultures. And much of the Anzacs would roll over in their grave if they knew that the kids following them are from Asia, Africa, and they're from all around the world. But isn't it great that as Australians we've grown to accommodate them?
Yes, and I think that would be a maturity.
Yeah, that is an element. And look, we've got a way to go.
Sure.
But at least we're heading in the right direction in that regard.
And no, we don't hold it against you being French. I know that you probably have a harder time fitting into the UK. That goes without saying.
Well,
Steve,
I must be every Englishman's nightmare because I'm French and Australian.
Oh, you've hit the dynamic duo, I think. Steve, you got a question?
Just quickly, quick anecdote before then. When I was growing up, Frenchness was looked down upon. I remember people horrified at the thought of being invited to our place to eat because they might get garlic in the food. That actually happened to me. I was very aware of my outsiderness growing up.
So you got Vegemite every morning just to inculcate you with the culture?
Look, my mum, brilliant cook, we ate French, and most people who came, loved it, were astonished that garlic actually tasted nice. But yeah, we were different because we were French. We weren't Anglo-British.
We're there now. Steve, sorry, your question.
Yeah, look, I think that last comment of yours, I think, is really helpful, particularly in light of the current, I would say, almost in some degree, demonizing of white man in a wrong way. Like I think it's helpful when you look at history and you recognize the lessons that we have learned and the fact that we actually should and can celebrate the positive changes that have occurred. And I fear sometimes that this whole idea of not looking at history with an honest look and recognizing the mistakes that we've made, and equally at the same time recognizing and being able to celebrate the positive changes that have happened. And I suppose, like, it's interesting you say that you're French, because I'm sort of half German, half British, a third Irish, actually. So I'm a big mix in that respect.
You're like a walking Australian pub joke, Steve.
No, I'm probably more like a mongrel, like, to be honest, and that's probably also my accent fits really well with all that mix. But nonetheless, I really appreciate that. But one question I had that's probably a little bit left field, but I thought we don't get an expert like yourself that often, and I've always been intrigued by the idea behind. Because I didn't really know that much about it when I was in the UK, but here in Australia, a lot of people tend to think that it was Churchill's fault that Anzac Day went so badly wrong, as in so many Australians tragically lost their life. And you tend to see this in modern sort of renditions of films where Churchill, I think in one of his recent movies, you see him sort of almost weeping over the idea that he made some tragic mistakes. And I wondered whether you could enlighten us in that respect and just say, look, what you know and how true that really is. And you won't offend me by saying he was totally wrong. Like I
Yeah. Look, strangely enough, in World War II, historians have noted how similar Churchill and Hitler were in their strategic sense. They had 1,000 ideas a day, and most of them were bad. And they pressured their generals into doing them. Churchill had an obsession with the Mediterranean. Let's invade through Italy. Let's invade through Greece, the soft underbelly of Europe. You just have to pull out a map and see that it's all mountains. It's a terrible place to invade. Churchill could be spectacularly wrong at times, but then equally he could be spectacularly right. And he was in his interwar campaign against fascism in Europe. That was something he got right, and importantly right. But at the same time, strategically, he was a disaster. I mean, Allenbrook, the chief of staff, Churchill was his nightmare because he was always coming up with brilliant ideas that were absolutely hopeless. Look, Gallipoli was one of them. It's unfair to blame it all on Churchill. There were a string of mistakes that were made, and Churchill's only responsible for some of them. Down the bottom end, a significant number of Australian leaders were responsible as well. Generals, colonels, majors, captains made bad decisions, but it's much more convenient for the Anzac legend to blame it all on the Poms. Stupid British generals, Churchill mistaken. Look, the Australians went through a very steep learning curve militarily in World War I, and by the end of the war, the Australian divisions, alongside the Canadians, the Kiwis, and a number of British divisions, were considered elite divisions, and rightly so. But they had to learn, and they learned through trial and error the same way everyone else did.
Good
Thanks.
point.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Steve, I just have a slide question for you here. We're into almost our last 10 minutes, and I really would like to get to our question on revisionism before we move on, considering it's so topical. Would you mind moving to those slides, please, and I'll bring those up. Was it the next slide? I think we
this is particularly this is the next one. This is particularly about Churchill at the moment, so it's quite pertinent that we're talking about him.
Yes. So falsification, historical revisionism. We note people today pulling down statues of less than perfect historical forebears. Are they trying to erase an unpalatable history? And Steve, there's a second slide from this one too, if you'll just move that on.
Do you want me to just flick that one as well? Yep.
Yes, please. In that vein, people try to present a secular view of our past, and we have sort of touched on this and danced around this a little bit so far. Is it possible to celebrate the Anzac spirit without invoking a Christian basis?
Is it possible to celebrate the Anzac spirit without invoking a Christian basis? Yes. I think I prefer to start with the beginning of the question and work the way through to the end.
Sure. Steve, can you just take it back on the slide, please?
Sure.
So I'm really glad that revisionism takes place, because as a historian, it would limit me to very little to write about. You know, if once something was written, that was it. We are constantly revising history, and we do it not because history's changed. Actually, I need to get in some definitions. What do we mean when we use the word history? We actually mean 3 or 4 things, and we blend them all together. So we use history to mean anything that happened in the past. We use history to mean a history book. We use it in all sorts of ways. So let me make 2 definitions clear. First of all, what happened in the past, and secondly, the practice of writing about it and remembering. All right. Now, the practice of writing about history is quite different from what happened in the past. As a historian, my job is to sift through the past and make sense of it. Now, I always make sense of it in the light of the present. History is not a study of the past. It is actually a study of the present through the lens of the past. And that is why historians are constantly rewriting history, why we're still getting new books on Caesar and Queen Elizabeth I and the Reformation and, you know, all the great events. Is there anything new to say? By and large, not really. The same set of facts are known. What's changed is our perspective. And for instance, when we write Anzac history today, we are sensitive to issues that never occurred to them back then. Issues of race, issues of gender, you know, all of these things. And so we have a new perspective on the same set of evidence. History as a discipline is not what happened, but why it matters. All right? Why it matters, significance. And so historians are always rewriting because different things matter in different cultures. And I think it's appropriate that we reapproach the Anzac legend and ask questions about the Anzac narrative based on kind of the received version, the King James version of the Anzac legend, which is unquestionable. You know, we're not allowed to tackle any of it in popular opinion. I've been attacked by some very close friends for questioning things. And where does the Anzac... Sorry?
How dare you?
Yeah, exactly. How dare I, especially as I'm a Frenchman, no Anzacs in my ancestry. Ironically, the person who attacked me the most was Greek. I found that very interesting. But let's get back to it. History always needs to be revisited. We always need to question with rigor what we've been handed down as received history. And in some areas, we're doing it in directions where society will back us, for example, on issues of race and gender. In other areas, we're doing it against the grain of our culture, and that happens to be right now in the area of religion. I'm not sure that tearing down statues is trying to erase unpalatable history, but making a statement that we no longer honour a particular set of values that motivated people in the past. All right? So while I don't think it's a blanket, let's tear down every monument to our past, it certainly is worth asking, what about our past are we foregrounding? What are we honouring? And let's take a few current examples. Statues of Captain Cook or Sir Edmund Barton up at Port Macquarie. Cook, it's hard to say whether he was racist or not by our standards. He probably was, but it wasn't an issue with him. Barton, no doubt about it. By our standards, he was racist. He was white Australian, like 99.99% of Australians at the time. See, it's an awkward thing because it's a matter of judgment. Are we honouring Barton for his establishment of a white Australia policy, which he did, or are we honouring Barton for a whole lot of other things that we actually find very beneficial? The fact is he was responsible for a range of things, and some of them we regret. Others are a bit more clear-cut. You know, if I erect a statue to a guy whose racism, whose attacks on particular ethnicities was the main focus of what he was on about, I'm happy to say that I don't stand for that. And I'm not going to put up a statue in his honour, all right? But this isn't black and white. This is a continuum. This is something that we'll have to negotiate as a group, and this is where we need public conversation, where we hear at least as much as what we say. Because I think what's missing in a lot of this debate isn't people willing to express their opinion. It is the rest of us willing to lay aside what we think to genuinely hear the concerns of other people. Yeah, and to me, that's the ultimate Christianity. I mean, what is the gospel narrative? Did God not know what we're on about? Yeah, he did. It's we who didn't know what he was on about. So what does he do? Does he come down and talk to us? No. Jesus spends 30 years of his life working in a carpenter shop, you know, experiencing our world from his perspective. The gospel is about the power of grace and love and power laying itself aside for the disempowered, those who don't belong, those who ought to be condemned. You know, that's the irony of the gospel. The wrong guy gets killed. And yeah. This is something I'd like to see in our national conversation, the ability to listen at least as much as we talk.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a very thoughtful approach to these, because it's very easy to get partisan and enjoy our own perspectives, and even reflective people can have not enough mirrors on certain topics at times, and that's good. Harvey, you popped some interesting points in the chat pod. Did you just want to bring those up in our last couple of minutes here before we sign off?
Yeah, just one of the things that the West celebrated was the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in the Second Gulf War, and it's because he wasn't on our side, and therefore pulling his statue down was, you know, that's the privilege of the victor. So we're not exactly completely against iconoclasm in the West. It depends on whose statue is coming down. If it's one of our heroes, we whine about it. If it's not, then we can applaud it. Most people would be happy with Kim Jong-il's statue coming down, because, you know, we might think he's an overblown ego megalomaniac. So the statue thing, as Daniel quite rightly says, means different things to different people. Just as an aside, you know, communist commentators in Russia laugh about that under communism, it's the future that's absolutely certain. It's the past that needs revision.
Yes.
So, I wanted to ask you about Russell Crowe's directed and acted in movie The Water Diviner, and I wondered whether that kind of approach to the Anzac story was more historically fair. Personally, I thought it was. What's your thought?
I didn't like it at all. Okay. I thought it was weak as a film and weak as a representation. It's the kind of, let's show the Turkish side of things from a very Western perspective. And I guess for many Australian audiences, it was a revelation. So maybe I'm being a bit tough on it, but I didn't find it convincing. I thought the Turks that they represented were the kind of Turks we wished they were, rather than being a genuinely Turkish point of view.
So more a trope was used, do you think, than...
Yeah. This was a film made for Australian audiences, and it's addressing Australian needs. It's not actually, it doesn't have anything invested in telling a Turkish perspective. It is the Turkish perspective that Australians want to hear.
Sure.
But it's not a very palatable Turkish perspective because they won. And
yeah, well, you see,
we might be laughed at by being the only country in the world that seems to idolize our armed forces in defeat.
Historical movies aren't about the past. Historical movies don't tell us about Gallipoli. They tell us about Australia, the year in which the film was made. Because those films, I mean, I've studied the shifting nature of representation in Anzac movies. And the fact is, the movies aren't really saying anything about Anzac. They're saying what set of values a contemporary audience is bringing to Anzac.
Thank you, Daniel.
Like
That's
Marvel
great.
Comics.
Marvel comics they're like Anzac movies, only more. Their suits are a bit different. Look, I'm just wondering, gents, we've hit our 3 o'clock mark, and that's it. You've stayed your hour, and we don't want to abuse any time. It's fascinating. Daniel, I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind taking, this open mic time now, maybe just to summarise and chart the importance again of your work for contemporary Australian Christians in particular.
Yes, look, I think there are many aspects of national narratives that we need to balance the need for having a national narrative. I mean, national narratives unify us, and that's important. I don't knock the Anzac legend for being there, because what it does is hold up in front of us a set of ideals that we can all work towards, mateship, a fair go, getting on with the job, even if we don't have the resources. These aren't bad things for us to share. At the same time, let's not believe that the myth is what actually happened. And let's take the time to question our own national narrative so that we're not blinded by them. That we actually recognise the complexity, the humanity that's in there. And there are all sorts of blind spots within the Anzac myth, and there are a number of historians who are trying to address this. One of them is religion. The fact is, a significant minority of Anzacs took faith seriously. Why can't we admit that? Why can't we deal with that? Why can't we go back and explore the fact that for some men, faith was what kept them in the fight. Faith was what kept them sane. Faith was what gave them purpose and direction. I think that's worth saying. And I can say that as a secular person. I don't have to be religious to admit that religion mattered to people in very real ways during the First World War.
Daniel, thanks very much for that. I really appreciate your time with us, and we'll end the broadcast pretty soon. Just wondered, Steve or Harvey, if you just had any final closing comments from our time. Steve, you're nodding voraciously there.
Yeah, look, I think that the thing that concerns me personally about all these pulling down of statues, it's not so much the statue. I've got no investiture in, and to be honest, my historical knowledge is not sufficient to know which one of them now did well or not. But I'm mindful of the fact that the statues sometimes are, in my opinion, an opportunity to have a conversation about the past. And so by removing them, we actually remove the opportunity to have a conversation. And I think and I guess I'd be interested to sort of have your final comment on that. And is that not part of the fear that we generally, we are seeing a polarization in society, generally in the Western speaking world, that seeks to shy away from having the real hard conversations, and we see this is kind of like the explosion of that happening, that we're not willing to have these conversations, and of course then what happens is that people react in all sorts of ways that we of course are very uncomfortable with, yeah, like that's sort of my fear in all of that. That I think that that's a very unhealthy reaction. That it's not actually helping; it's actually counterproductive.
Quickly then, as a conversation, look, the conversation really matters. Do we need the statue there to do it? I'm not sure. And remember that statues are cultural icons of what's important. And when we have a set of statues that represent one set of values and virtually no statues, no monuments that represent another set of values or another culture or an indigenous culture, we are saying by default only one culture matters, only one set of values matter. I think it is right for us to constantly question our iconography to make sure that it actually reflects who we are, what we value, what is of significance.
I think one final one, and I will make it the final one. Harvey typed this in, but I thought I'd grab it and make it as a banner as well, just so that people get the sense of the word. How do you respond to that, Daniel? Is there such a thing as culturecide, like there is genocide, fratricide, infanticide, chocolacide?
Yes, look, I guess there is. I guess whenever change happens, there's always a fear of what we'll lose. I'm probably less afraid of it than many people. I've found that virtually every culture I've come across, I'm fascinated by culture. I grew up in two cultures simultaneously. Every culture has some really foundational truths that underpin it that are incredibly valuable. And every culture has some deeply fundamental flaws that is just absolutely and utterly appalling. And the point isn't to kill a culture, because that would be to replace it with a culture that has, some equal but opposite virtues and flaws, but to actually interrogate our cultures, interrogate them and go, are we really happy with that being one of our core values? And from that conversation, see if we can progress our culture. And I think Australian culture has matured tremendously. I'm so grateful we are not culturally where we were, 100 years ago. But we're far from flawless. And there is a lot we can learn from other cultures. There's a lot we can learn from Aboriginal culture that we have very deliberately repressed and ignored. And that's not to say every feature of Aboriginal cultures has been good. But there are some things they do exceptionally well that we do quite poorly. The problem is we're not listening. And because we're the dominant culture, we find it natural not to listen. So I actually get it that minority cultures and minority ethnicities are saying, shut up and listen for a change. And that's a really good point. We do need to listen more.
And that actually is a wonderful, poignant statement to finish the broadcast on. Learn from the past for our future, and we do need to listen more. Ironic that I had to repeat that. Maybe it didn't show I was listening. But anyway, I want to say thank you to our viewing and listening audience. Thanks for those comments that were coming in. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. So that means I have to send out less emails and people will get automatic broadcasts of what has come your way and what will be new. And Daniel, specifically, directly, personally, professionally, thank you. It's been a very engaging and entertaining and enlightening chat. I'm sure the boys would like to say their goodbyes as well. Harvey, I've unmuted you. There was a bit of background noise. Sorry about that. I had to take that off.
No, that's
Gentlemen?
fine. Daniel, thank you so much. Your insights, your perspectives were refreshing and typically Australian, refreshingly blunt, which is great. You didn't mouse around with your opinions, which I think should become a characteristic of Australian culture. We say what we think and we put up with the consequences. So you've demonstrated it well, and thank you so much as well from a Christian perspective as well. To be Christian is being forced to be honest and to be forced to review all things in the light of the purity of Jesus. And he didn't shy away from the truth. He didn't shy away from cultural issues at the time. But his perspective, I think, gives us a good template on which to look at our own culture critically and the culture around us. And our eternal quest, of course, wherever we are, will be to toss out things that are typically not like the sort of culture Jesus would embrace, and to retain the things that he would. And hence, we are transcultural as opposed to Christian cultural.
Thanks, Harvey. All right, folks, thanks so much for joining us. Join us at our next broadcast. We won't tell you who we've got coming up yet because we haven't planned that. But I'm sure when we do, you'll know all about it. It is the Pope. It is the Pope. And again,
shouldn't have given that away, Phil.
Yeah. I don't have the right hat for that. Daniel Reynaud, thank you very much. We wish you all the best with your ongoing academic career, and may it add, as it already has, add value to the Australian culture as we move forward, learning more about ourselves and the place of Christ within that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, chaps, our broadcast is ended.